The Great Locomotive Chase or Andros Raid was a military raid that occurred on April 12, 1862, in northern Georgia during the American Civil War. The volunteers from the Union Army, led by civilian scout James J.Andrews, commandeered a train and took it northward toward Chattanooga, Tennessee, doing as much damage as possible to the vital Western and Atlantic Railroad line from Atlanta to Chattanooga as they went. They were pursued by Confederate forces at first on foot, and later on a succession of locomotives for 87 miles. Because the Union men had cut the telegraph wires, the Confederates could not send warnings ahead to forces along the railway. Confederates eventually captured the raiders and executed some quickly as spies, including Andrews. Some others were able to flee. Some of the raiders were the first to be awarded the Medal of Honor by the U.S. Congress for their actions. As a civilian, Andrews was not eligible. Background: Major General Ormsby M. Mitchell, commanding the Federal troops in Middle Tennessee, planned to move south from the Union base at Nashville, to seize and sever the Memphis and Charleston Railway between Memphis and Chattanooga, and ultimately capture the strategic water and railway junction of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Mitchell recognized the strategic value of seizing the rail and water transportation center of Chattanooga, and of cutting off Memphis, Tennessee, from rail communication with the Eastern Confederacy, first by severing the Memphis and Charleston, and ultimately by capturing Chattanooga. At the time there was no other railway link between the river and the east. At the time, the standard means of capturing a city was by encirclement to cut it off from supplies and reinforcements. Then would follow artillery bombardment and direct assault by massed infantry. However, Chattanooga's natural water and mountain barriers to its east and south made this nearly impossible with the forces that Mitchell had available. But, if he could somehow block railroad reinforcement of the city from Atlanta to the southeast, he could take Chattanooga. The Union Army would then have rail reinforcement and supply lines to its rear, leading west to the Union-held stronghold and supply depot of Nashville, Tennessee. James J.Andrews, who was a civilian scout and part-time spy, proposed a daring raid to Mitchell that would destroy the Western and Atlantic Railroad as a useful supply link to Chattanooga, thereby isolating the city from Atlanta. He recruited the civilian William Hunter Campbell and 22 volunteer Union soldiers from 3 Ohio regiments, the 2nd, 21st, and 33rd Ohio Infantry. Andrews instructed the men to arrive in Marietta, Georgia, by midnight of April 10, but heavy rain caused a one-day delay. They traveled in small parties in civilian attire to avoid arousing suspicion. All but 2 reached the designated rendezvous point at the appointed time. Llewellyn and Smith joined a Confederate artillery unit as they had been instructed to do in such circumstances. Andrews' proposal was a combined operation. General Mitchell and his forces would first move on Chattanooga, then the Andrews raid would promptly destroy the rail line between Chattanooga and Atlanta. This essentially simultaneous actions would bring about the capture of Chattanooga. Andrews' raid was intended to deprive the Confederates of the integrated use of the railways to respond to a Union advance, using their interior lines of communication. When the Union Army threatened Chattanooga, the Confederate States Army would first reinforce Chattanooga's garrison from Atlanta. When sufficient forces had been deployed to Chattanooga to stabilize the situation and hold the line, the Confederates would then launch a counterattack from Chattanooga with the advantage of a local superiority of men and material. It was this process that the Andrews raid sought to disrupt. The chase. Because railway dining cars were not yet in common use, railroad timetables included water, rest, and meal stops. In addition, as the locomotives of the time needed to frequently replenish fuel and water, Stops for passenger and crew meals were combined with the stops for water and fuel for passenger railway travel. The raid began on April 12, 1862, when the regular morning northbound passenger train with the locomotive General stopped at Big Shanty, Georgia, on its regular run from Atlanta to Chattanooga, so that the crew and passengers could breakfast at the Lacey Hotel. There Andros and his raiders hijacked the General and the train's first car. The plan was to take the train north towards Chattanooga, stopping to damage or destroy track, bridges, telegraph wires, and track switches behind them, so as to prevent the Confederate Army from being able to move troops and supplies from Atlanta to Chattanooga. The raiders planned to cross through the Federal siege lines on the outskirts of Chattanooga and rejoin Mitchell's army. They chose to capture the train at Big Shanty Station because it had no telegraph office. They steamed out of Big Shanty, leaving behind startled passengers, crew members, and onlookers, which included a number of Confederate soldiers from Camp McDonald, directly opposite the Lacey Hotel. The train's conductor, William Allen Fuller, and two other men, chased the stolen train, first on foot, then by hand car. Locomotives at the time normally averaged 15 miles per hour, with short bursts of an average speed of 20 miles per hour. In addition, the terrain north of Atlanta is very hilly, and the ruling grades are steep. Even today, average speeds are usually never greater than 40 miles per hour between Chattanooga and Atlanta. Since Andros intended to stop periodically to perform acts of sabotage, a determined pursuer, even on foot, could conceivably have caught up with the train before it reached Chattanooga. In his foot race north, Fuller spotted the locomotive owner at Etowah and commandeered it, chasing the raiders north all the way to Kingston. There, Fuller switched to the locomotive William R. Smith and continued north towards Adairsville. 2 miles south of Adairsville, however, the raiders had destroyed the tracks, and Fuller was forced to continue the pursuit on foot. Beyond the damaged section, he took command of the southbound locomotive Texas at Adairsville, running it backwards, tender first, northward. The raiders never got far ahead of Fuller. Destroying the railway behind the hijacked train was a slow process. The raiders were too few in number and were too poorly equipped with the proper railway track tools and demolition equipment, or with suitable igniters and explosives to effectively close the line. Also, the raiders had stolen a regularly scheduled train on its route, and they needed to keep to the train's timetable. If they reached a siding ahead of schedule, they had to wait there until scheduled southbound trains passed them before they could continue north. As well, railway officials in Chattanooga had sufficient time to evacuate engines and rolling stock to the south, hauling critical railroad supplies away from the Union threat, so as to prevent their either being captured by General Mitchell or trapped uselessly inside Chattanooga during a Union siege of the city. Andros claimed to the station masters he encountered that his train was a special northbound ammunition movement ordered by General Beauregard in support of his operations against the Union forces threatening Chattanooga. This story was sufficient for the isolated station masters Andros encountered, but it had no impact upon the train dispatchers and station masters north of him, whose telegraph lines to Chattanooga were working. These dispatchers were following their orders to dispatch and control the special train movements southward at the highest priority. As the first of the southbound freight evacuation trains approached, Andros inquired of the train's conductor why his train was carrying a red marker flag on its rear car. Andros was told that Confederate railway officials in Chattanooga had been notified by Confederate Army officials that Lieutenant Mitchell was approaching Chattanooga from Stevens, Alabama, intending to either capture or lay siege to the city, and as a result of this warning, the Confederate military railways had ordered the special freight movements. The red train marker flag on the southbound train meant that there was at least one additional train behind the one which Andros had just encountered, and that Andros had no authority for movement until the last train of that sectional movement had passed him. This gave Fuller all the time he needed to close the distance. The raiders considered stopping to attack and overwhelm the first work party they encountered, who were operating a locomotive, the Yonah, at Etowah. If the Yonah had been seized, it could possibly have been run at high speed and derailed, demolished, and/or its boiler deliberately exploded in a tunnel or covered bridge. This would have not only stopped Fuller's pursuit, but it would also have achieved the raiders' mission of closing the line between Marietta and Chattanooga. However, given the size of the Yonah's work party relative to the size of the raiding party, Andros judged that any firefight would be too long and too involved, and would alert nearby troops and civilians. The Texas train crew had been bluffed by Andros into taking the station siding, thereby allowing the general to continue northward along the single-truck main line. Fuller, when he met the Texas, took command of her, picked up 11 Confederate troops at Calhoun, and continued his pursuit. With the Texas still chasing the general tender first, the two trains steamed through Dalton and Tunnel Hill. The raiders continued to sever the telegraph wires, but they were unable to burn bridges or damage Tunnel Hill. The wood they had hoped to burn was soaked by rain. Finally, at milepost 116.3, north of Ringgold, Georgia, just 18 miles from Chattanooga, with the locomotive out of fuel, Andros' men abandoned the general and scattered. Andros and all of his men were caught within 2 weeks, including the two who had missed the hijacking. Aftermath. Confederate forces charged all the raiders with acts of unlawful belligerency. The civilians were charged as unlawful combatants and spies. All the prisoners were tried in military courts or courts-martial. Tried in Chattanooga, Andros was found guilty. He was executed by hanging on June 7 in Atlanta. On June 18, 7 others who had been transported to Knoxville and convicted as spies were returned to Atlanta and also hanged. Their bodies were buried unceremoniously in an unmarked grave. Writing about the exploit, Corporal William Pittenger said that the remaining raiders worried about also being executed. They attempted to escape and aid succeeded. Traveling for hundreds of miles in pairs, they all made it back safely to Union lines, including 2 who were aided by slaves and Union sympathizers and 2 who floated down the Chattahoochee River until they were rescued by the Union blockade vessel Somerset. The remaining 6 were held as prisoners of war and exchanged for Confederate prisoners on March 17, 1863. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton awarded some of the raiders with the First Medal of Honor. Private Jacob Wilson Parrott, who had been physically abused as a prisoner, was awarded the first. Later, all but 2 of the other soldiers who had participated in the raid also received the medal, with posthumous awards to families for those who had been executed. As civilians, Andros and Campbell were not eligible. Raiders. In popular culture, the pursuit of Andros' raiders was featured in the Buster Keaton silent film comedy The General. The Walt Disney dramatic film The Great Locomotive Chase, starring Fess Parker as Andros, was also based on these exploits. Robert W. Smith wrote a piece for concert band named for the incident. The Great Locomotive Chase Festival, held annually in Adairsville, Georgia, commemorates the event. Monument and markers. The Ohio Monument dedicated to Andros raiders is located at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. There is a scale model of the general on top of the monument, and a brief history of the Great Locomotive Chase. The general is now in the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History, Kennesaw, Georgia, while the Texas is on display at the Atlanta Cyclorama. One marker indicates where the chase began, near the Big Shanty Museum in Kennesaw, while another shows where the chase ended at milepost 116.3, north of Ringgold, not far from the recently restored depot at milepost 114.5. There is a historic marker in downtown Atlanta, at the corner of 3rd and Juniper Streets, at the site where Andros was hanged. Historic sites along the 1862 Chase route include marker near Big Shanty Museum, Big Shanty Village Historic District, Camp McDonald, Ackworth Downtown Historic District, Tarleton Morehouse, Grand Theater, Old Bartow County Courthouse, now the Bartow History Museum, built so close to the railroad that court was interrupted when any train passed. Not built until 1869. Adairsville Historic District, the Calhoun Depot, built in 1852–53, at Calhoun, 10 miles north of Adairsville. Calhoun Downtown Historic District, William Taylor House, associated with Northern Georgia soldiers who fought for the Union in the Civil War, though house not built until 1913. Masonic Lodge No. 238, not built until 1915. Dalton Commercial Historic District, Western and Atlantic Depot, Dalton, Georgia. Crown Mill Historic District, Western and Atlantic Railroad Tunnel at Tunnel Hill. Ringgold Gap, Battlefield Gap between White Oak Mountain and Taylor Ridge through which railway runs. Site of November 1863 battle protecting Confederate retreat after Battle of Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga. Ringgold Depot, Ringgold Commercial Historic District, marker at milepost 116.3. Bibliography. Daring and Suffering, A History of the Great Railroad Adventure, Lieutenant William Pittenger. Daring and Suffering, A History of the Andros Railroad Raid, by William Pittenger, with introduction by Col. James G. Bogle, a first-hand account of one of the raiders, with an introduction by one of the foremost experts on the subject. Wild Train, The Story of the Andros Raiders, by Charles O'Neill, long considered one of the most authoritative accounts of the raid. The Case of Private Smith and the Remaining Mysteries of the Andros Raid, by Parley C. Gross, focuses on the fates of the 3 soldiers who started off with the rest of the company but did not reach Marietta. Overd Wellfit, James Smith and Samuel Llewellyn, who joined a Confederate unit as directed by Andros when they were stopped and sharply questioned en route, and an unknown 3rd soldier, stealing the general, the Great Locomotive Chase and the First Medal of Honor, by Russell S. Bonds. The Great Locomotive Chase, The Andros Raid 1862, by Gordon L. Rotman, Osprey Raid Series No. 5.